Well, thank you to all three of you. That was such a massive brain dump of information. A lot of great numbers, and I just made notes of a couple of things that I'm going to add to that. Is Amber talked about like the number of empty homes in China, and that great image of just tower after tower of empty homes. Chicago, a lot of those high rises, you see these massive high rises. If you drive through Chicago right now, there's tons and tons of cranes in the city. The population of the city is actually going down. A lot of those high rises are largely empty buildings as well. In Door County, we have, I don't know the exact figures right now, but roughly 26,000 housing units, I think is the number, and about 9 to 12,000 of those are empty at any given time. So roughly half of our housing stock is just not being used as we grapple with these issues. We talk about construction costs, and I was just writing a story this week about Eagle Tower. 30% increase in construction costs from what they initially expected. So that their lowest bid to rebuild Eagle Tower came in at $1.6 million more than the budget. So as of right now, beloved icon of Door County is looking at least a 4 to 5 month delay, and that's if they can bring the cost down. I don't know how they will do it. They say they can, but to trim that down by $1.6 million and still build a structure similar to what they've been talking about. And I've talked to a lot of builders, a lot of architects in the process of putting together our sustainability issue. Every single one of them just talked about the 15 to 30% increase in costs and labor to do anything, whether it's a very nice, expensive home or affordable. And then you talk about those incomes that Mariah put a lot of those numbers out there about what people make and what they should be able to afford. But there's another context to that in if you are that cook or that server and working in the service industry in Door County, that's not a reliable, steady income. So you can't just go into your year and look at your rental payments and go, well, I'm making 36. I'm going to make that every year so I can sign this lease for a year at that $900 or $1,200 rent level, which is what most of them are, somewhere in there, and just be a little more frugal. Because even if you're being frugal, if your particular restaurant where you have that job just doesn't have a great year, or they're just bad management. I was a restaurant owner. Some of us are bad at running restaurants. I might have been one of them. And then they cut your shift, and you cut down one shift a week. That's 20% of your income. You know, so you very quickly go, if you do try and go, all right, I can make that $800 or $900 a month rent work. Something like as simple as that can just start making you go into debt and start racking up credit card payments, and then you're in that spiral. So that unreliability of the income up here is one thing that doesn't show up in these studies, but is a very real factor for anybody who works in the service industry, as most of us who have grown up here do at one point or another, or most of us who come here at some point or another probably worked in a service industry here. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to hit them with a few questions that I have, and then we're going to take some note cards got passed around, and some people may have filled out some questions of your own, and we'll pass those up and get to some of those as well. But the biggest question I have is, why does any of this matter? I mean, if you can't afford to live here, shouldn't you just move somewhere else?
You said you weren't going to test us with that one. You said beforehand that he wasn't going to throw that one. Okay, well, to start off, what do you really think that, in my mind, if you can't afford to work here, we all depend on every economic level of society to create a fully functioning, vibrant, healthy community. So I don't think that you can exclusionary say, if you can't afford $250,000 a year for a house, then you're not viable to live here, because it's all sectors of society and the economy that comes together to bring this unique culture that we do have in Door County. I really do feel that there's a lot of creativity. I mean, I used to hear stories of back in the day when it was like a hippie commune where we were settled by artists. There was a lot, that's where our art, our gallery, our music, fishermen, all of these aspects that really make Door County so amazingly unique, and the reason that a lot of people come to visit us as well. So to have a sort of exclusionary society where only if you can afford $250,000 a year would be a detriment to our culture, our vibrancy, and also we depend on all these people for all of our services as well.
Anything to add?
I was going to tag on to, I agree with Amber, obviously. in order to have a diverse community, both economically, socially, everything else, we need to have a variety of housing types and housing costs. And there are actually elected officials in this county that I've heard say that, well, if they can't afford a house or afford to live here, then they don't deserve to live here. And it's been said recently. And I think maybe the way to appeal to those people is the last part of what Amber said, which is to say who's going to wait on you in your favorite restaurant or cook your food, or who's going to take care of you when you're in the nursing home or whatever else. So if they're really not altruistic enough to want to have that diverse community, you can try and make it personal and selfish.
So. And the truth is, an unbalanced community will just start degrading. You know, we will be reaching a decline if we don't support the people who are supporting all of us.
Right.
So we have to have housing for them, and we have to figure this out. And it has to be respectable housing. You know, we have to elevate a sense of pride in what people do and where they live. And only by doing that can we have a really cohesive, vibrant, successful community. It's incumbent upon us to make sure that we have housing for to encourage diversity of all types.
Yeah.
One of the solutions that some people, when we posted all our articles from the sustainability issue on Facebook, you get people chiming in. Several people have emailed me or chimed in on Facebook about, well, it's cheap in Southern Door, why not just make that commute? We can just, people can live cheaply in Southern Door and Kewaunee County, and that will save them the money, and I commute, so why can't you? I'm going to give this to Virge, by the way.
Yeah. I don't know. I see that as a matter of quality of life. You know, not only a quality of life, but also an environmental issue. You know, do we want people to have to spend 2-3 hours a day every day in their car in order to go to work? That doesn't leave time for family. That doesn't leave time for downtime. That doesn't leave time for anything that would possibly represent quality of life. But on top of that, we don't have public transportation here. So you've got the cost of the cars, and if you're in a low income level to start with, and your car breaks down, you've lost your job. And so we need to have housing close to where the jobs are. And we need to make sure that we don't have people having to drive 3 hours a day and use their gas up and create, all the exhaust fumes, frankly, of driving cars back and forth every single day to get to their jobs. So
single lane roads.
Single lane roads.
Yeah. Conversation earlier.
With 10 miles an hour under the speed limit.
Yes.
One thing that I forgot to mention in my portion of my remarks is that there's a new number out there as far as affordability. So you've got the 30% statistic that the Housing and Urban Development Agency thinks that is what's affordable. But now I've seen a number of different places talk about 45%, and then that 45% refers to the transportation costs and your housing costs, so that you're considered cost burdened if you're spending more than 45% of your income on housing and transportation. So the harder you make it for people to live near where they're working, the harder it is to hit that 45% number. And one of the things that when Becky was doing the research where we were looking at worker incomes and student loan debt and things like that, she looked up average car payment debt monthly in the US, and the number seemed so outlandish to us that we didn't even put it in there, but it's like over $300 a month for people that have a car payment is the average payment.
Yeah.
That's painful. All right, well, my take on this is I kind of reference back to, again, a global example for me that I'm aware of. I've spent some time living in London as well too, and I've seen something similar there. And the fact that, people have this idea that London is this vibrant city center full of life, teeming with culture, etc. Well, what's happened is, much as like I was talking about in China, is it's been very exclusionary in terms of who can come and live in downtown London right now, because the cost of rent, the cost of living is so high. So while during the day it might not necessarily be noticeable, but when it comes to the end of the day, you have this huge dead zone,
right? You have this huge, super, very expensive housing that nobody that works in the city can afford to live in. So they all take the trains out, an hour and a half out of the city every day, and that commute back and forth to work because they can't live in the city. What that has done has really disrupted the urban fabric of London for what it has always been, and it's become essentially a dead zone. So I think you have that could potentially happen as well too. And thinking of it, it just sounds like a really bad sci-fi movie or something.
Can I add one more?
Yeah.
I wanted to add one more thing to what Virge said too. If you're spending that much time in your car, and so all you have time to do is to scramble to get out of the house in the morning, get your kids to daycare, get to work, and get home, you don't have any time. Not only do you not have any time for fun, but you don't have any time to volunteer in the community, to serve on planning commissions and boards, to go to meetings, to be on your PTA and things like that. And I'm sure probably most of the people in this room are involved in some of those organizations, and you know how hard it is to find board members for things or to get people to show up for meetings and things like that. And so you lose like a whole huge element of civic life.
I know a few people walked in later in the meeting or in the session tonight, and I just wanted to reiterate like some of the statistics. We're not talking about people just at the bottom of the income barrel. We're talking about working professionals in Door County who are nurses as well, and like nurses and bartenders. All these kinds of like,
It's a good mix.
so it's even people with college degrees putting their degree to work who can't afford homes and rents and purchasing homes in Door County. So what we just said there, why we do it, and we talked about the value to the community and keeping this a vibrant community. So what is government's responsibility in all this? Mariah, you mentioned like it can't happen without some sort of land acquisition, like cheap land from municipalities, things like that. What's the government's responsibility and what's the community's responsibility in trying to create affordable housing?
Her first.
Well, as a
No problem.
You're being recorded here, remember?
Yeah, I'm being recorded. No, it's not that none of the government in the county have done things. So the city of Sturgeon Bay has been pretty proactive, the village of Sister Bay, and maybe not coincidentally, because again, those are the places that have both public sewer and water, that those have been where people want to develop, or do more dense developments. But I think we seem to have clearly hit a tipping point here and globally and nationally, and so I think government does need to step up, like maybe they did in the 1940s, to make sure that this actually happens. And that's a question that we get all the time. Why should government be worrying about this? Why are we getting in the development business? Why don't we let the real estate agents, and developers take care of it? Well, the market obviously hasn't worked, so government is going to need to step in, and it doesn't seem. All sorts of other places around the country are doing it, so I think we should be able to figure it out as well. Virge wants to grab the mic.
Yeah, I do. Well, and one thing I want to discuss is, like in the 1940s, the reason that they started subsidizing all this housing and giving all this land to developers and whatnot is there were so many homeless people at that time, and there was so much dissatisfaction with the government, and the fact that, there were no services, there were no provisions for a decent lives for millions and millions of people. And there were riots in the street. And there was deadly disease spreading through communities. And so the government was frankly quite fearful that people were going to start revolting, and there would be an uprising against the government. And so the government put money forward and helped build these homes. And I did my master's thesis, and this is probably the reason I'm so obsessed about this. I did my master's thesis on family housing from 1939 through 1963. And so I spent a lot of time in the Library of Congress reading through, original documents of what was transpiring at that point. And I came across this one document, and it just blew my mind. And I can't remember whether it was Lyndon Johnson who scribbled in the margin or whether it was Truman. I forget which of those two it was, but the comment was made in argument for for creating 30-year mortgages, which were unheard of at that point. You know, prior to 1939, you could have a 5-year mortgage, but you had to put down over 50% to buy your house, and you had to pay it off in 5 years. So anyway, in 1939, the Construction Congress was developed, and they worked with the banks and created 30-year mortgages, first time in history. But this note that was scribbled in the margins actually said, a man who owns his own house and yard will not have enough time to become a communist. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's nice. Strategic, that.
Yeah.
I'm going to actually, on this point, I would have to say that it's a delicate blend between government and developers and community working together to come on this. But I do feel that government definitely has a role in this. And I'm going to go back to my example of Hong Kong again, primarily just because it is very heated, as Virge started to say. You know, it does start to really well up in society, and they get really upset for obvious reasons. But, you know, for example, in Hong Kong, when I was talking about some of the reasons why there was a shortage of housing, we talked about geography, right? You know, the mountains, the ocean. We talked about regulation and policy, or old regulation and policy. But what we didn't talk about was the fact that there is actually land that is available to be built on. It's flat, it's not rigorous, mountainous, and it is available for development. Now the thing is, the 3 largest Hong Kong developers own this land, and they are not building on it. And the reason they are not building on it is to drive up the prices of the buildings they already own in downtown Hong Kong. So, yeah. So that is why it gets super, super heated. And government is just like, oh, we'll just build an island. You know, that's their solution. Rather than having policy or incentivization or infrastructure to really say, hey, you know, you can't just hold on to this land for X amount of time, you know, to the detriment of the rest of our society. So while I do feel that, developers have a big role to play, I do think it's a definite balance with government getting involved. Because in a situation like that, you need a governing body. And it needs to be remembered that governments are for all people, not just developers or those with money.
Can I add something else?
Yeah.
One other role of government, I guess one thing that I would say is that we've got, I think, 2 responsibilities, or at least I feel like my office has 2 responsibilities. One of which is to make sure that our zoning codes are trying to keep up with, because we're definitely not trend setting, keep
Not
up
yet.
with demand and things that make sense and everything else. And so that isn't going to necessarily in and of itself get housing built, but at least we're not an obstacle if we can try and create zoning opportunities that make sense. We do also have the delicate balance, a different delicate balance than Amber mentioned, of we live in a really fragile place. So we don't want to just stick really dense, really intense uses probably almost anywhere in this county. So we do need to be really careful. And again, I keep going back to, that's why Sister Bay and Sturgeon Bay are in some respects the best places to put some of these housing configurations now, because they do have public sewer and water. So there's the piece of not being an obstacle, but then also trying to be more proactive and work with different partnering organizations and the housing trust and everything else.
Good.
I want to talk tiny homes, because that's one of the other things that shows up when we have these conversations, especially people on the younger end. They say, yes, let's just do tiny homes. That's the solution. We'll just build a bunch of these. But I know a lot of my conversations with builders and from a couple of the folks on this panel, not so fond of the tiny homes as the end-all solution for this. But they are very trendy. They look kind of cool and hip. But are they realistic? Maybe that starts with Virge.
All right, start on that end.
Well,
Tell us what you really
they are cool and hip, and I love watching YouTube videos of them because frankly, they're pretty interesting. They're basically like they're designed almost like boats. Every square inch of a tiny home is used for something necessary, and I actually watched a video of a Korean architect who had taken his, I think it was a 10-foot by 15-foot home that he and his family of 4 lived in. And, and within that very, very tiny, tiny space, he had a full-size kitchen, a bathroom with a shower, beds that pulled out from the wall. Everything was integrated and multifunctional. It was amazing. But tiny homes, you know, when I think about 1 or 2 people living in them, that's probably fine, but frankly, I cannot imagine. I read an article about a couple who built a tiny home, and they were so proud of it, and they had their bedroom up in the loft, and they said they were so comfortable up there with them and their 3-year-old daughter. And I thought, you know, that girl is going to grow up and not gonna like sleeping with her parents anymore. So, you know, that's why I say I think they're kind of a fad. They're kind of kitschy right now. They're cute, but and it'd probably be just fine for, you know, seasonal workforce housing. It'd probably be an ideal situation for something like that. But for families, no, I can't see it.
So from a regulatory standpoint, the issue is, and if you go online and look up this stuff, the whole country is struggling with how to define them. So if it's still on wheels, they're generally considered a camping unit. So it needs to be in a campground, which we would allow under county zoning, or it needs to follow the rules, which we have that are pretty restrictive about camping on your own property. And I've also, well, and so that's, as far as county zoning, it's a camping unit if it's on wheels. If you want to take it off of the wheels and put it on a slab, then we would allow it as a secondary dwelling unit, so in conjunction with your single family residence. Or if you were in a zoning district where it was zoned for multifamily, if you wanted to put a whole bunch of tiny homes on slabs, then we could allow that as a multifamily development. But once you put it on a slab, it's got to meet the building code requirements. And from my research and discussions with people, that's when they start getting expensive, and they're not really all that cheap anymore. Plus, you're living in 150 square feet with apparently your daughter and your spouse. Like,
And if I can add
Yep,
something to that, yeah, actually, the Dora Kiwani Building Collaborative, the students that build houses
yeah.
every year.
Business and education partner.
Yeah, they were actually looking at doing a tiny home 3 years ago. And they thought it would be an ideal project. Long and short of it is that tiny home would have cost $400 a square foot to build. And so it was out of their budget. They simply couldn't do it. So they're not cheap. And frankly, if you're going to be doing small units of housing like that, it's going to be a lot more affordable if you gang them all together. Cost of construction is much less expensive if you can gang the buildings together. So, you know, a dormitory situation for seasonal housing, frankly, might be a better solution.
The one last thing I was going to say about tiny houses, because we did do a whole lot of
You
research
have lots
about
to say.
4 years ago.
Clearly.
Well, no,
I should have started.
I've talked to a local builder that says they are not good in Wisconsin. Like, they're just not. I mean, I'm sure you could build one that would sustain or I can't think of the word, that you could survive in, withstand
winter.
the Wisconsin winter. But generally, they're not a great option. And one article that I had read was a couple that also built their tiny house and were so proud of it, and they were driving around the country, but they quickly realized that that's a really small space to live in with another person, and it worked best in a warm climate where the outdoors, where you walk to your tiny house, is also your living room, your dining room, everything else. So you're not actually really living in 150 square feet.
Oh, no, all great points. I don't have that much to say. My only concern with tiny homes, well, on top of what you guys have already said, is essentially I kind of see them, because they are as trendy as they are, that they're almost disposable, and that they don't last the test of time, which in my opinion is not sustainable, because I don't think that when I turn 80 I want to be climbing up a ladder up into my bed. So, you know, it doesn't it's not sustainable in that aspect either. I do think they're cute. I do think potentially good for seasonal workers as well. I think they're really innovative in the way that they use space, and it's kind of this good lab exercise. But in terms of long-term solutions, I don't.
Stop, one more. I keep thinking of things after. I wanted to explain actually quickly why under county zoning, and I think this would probably be the same under the city and the villages as well, why you can't have one just as a house on a lot. And that's because zoning codes almost ubiquitously throughout the country have a minimum square footage requirement for a single family home. So if you're going to stick a housing unit on a lot all by itself, it's a single family home, and it needs to meet our minimum square footage requirements. Ours are much smaller than the county, or I'm sorry, than the city of Sturgeon Bay requires. So the county zoning ordinance, it's 750 square feet for 1 or 2 bedrooms, I can't remember which, and then 1,000 square feet for a single family home, but that's why we can only allow them as a campground unit or a secondary dwelling unit.
I'd just like to say I'm glad tiny homes weren't around when my dad had the 8 of us. He would have tried it. He's here tonight. A couple comments from people that have been handed up. Gibraltar is considering purchasing a large plot of land. Town of Gibraltar, for those unfamiliar, they have taken out an option for $2.1 million to purchase 195 acres kind of behind the settlement shops and down below the bluff there. Part of that plan is to open some of that up for some sort of affordable housing project. And this person just said it would be beneficial for you all to present to the village electorate in their planning process all of the information you put out there tonight. And I agree with that comment. Whoever made that.
Thank you.
If you could wave a wand, like what's the low-hanging fruit? Because we've talked about like a lot of big structural things that we're not going to solve tomorrow, right? But people need houses now. Employers need employees right now. They need seasonal housing right now. Virge, some of what you talked about is kind of a long, hopefully not that long term, but it is a longer term mindset change in builders, in what communities want to allow, and what we are asking for out of builders. But what is there in terms of low-hanging fruit? What do you think would get the most bang for our buck to address that might make tangible differences in the next few years? Anybody got an idea?
Hand this over to the locals.
Do you have anything to say after that? I can't think of anything that's going to happen super quickly with Virge for a handout.
Well, money is an issue. Certainly money is an issue, but I'm looking at a lot of empty buildings around the county, and especially in Sturgeon Bay, that with the right incentives, those could be easily converted into apartments or condominiums or workforce housing. I think what it's going to take is all the townships, all the municipalities to study exactly how much housing they are going to need for their workforce and help subsidize, take some out of their coffers and help create workforce housing, at least workforce housing, and seasonal housing to take care of those. So, we have a lot of money in this county, we have a lot of money in this country, and in order to solve this problem, I think it's going to take, as you were asking earlier, what can the government do? I think the government is going to have to put up some money to take care of this issue, and we're just going to have to force our legislators to, loosen the purse strings a little bit so we can make this happen.
I can't think of anything that's going to help immediately, like for this season, but I think with getting the housing trust reestablished, to have a tool that's out there so that when housing is being developed that's considered affordable, that it can remain affordable is going to be a key component. And we're hoping that we're going to be up and ready for donations of land, buildings, and money by the end of this summer. And I think getting the zoning code changed, we're hoping to bring a whole package of housing-related amendments for the county zoning code to our committee within the next, it's going to take a while, but the next 8 to 10 months, let's say. That's going to take some education, though, because the way county zoning works, the towns that are under comprehensive county zoning, if we don't have the buy-in of 5 out of the 9, at least, they can actually legally block us from changing the text. So it's important to show up at meetings and pay attention to your local agendas. But I do think that the government role is key, and that's where we have a lot of talking and a lot of education to do, because I don't think that a lot of the local municipalities either were or maybe still are aware of what their options are and what's being done in other parts of the state and other parts of the country. And so I think I'm attempting to help.
Mariah, hold the mic for a little bit here.
Okay.
Because you mentioned the housing trust. So can you explain to us what a housing trust is, how that works? And also then this person asks, if you have this housing trust, can you accept tax-deductible contributions of land to be used for low-cost housing.
Yes. So there, if you go online and look at, across the country, they're generally called community land trusts. We're not calling ours a land trust for obvious reasons, because it would be really confusing in Door County. So, but the way a housing trust works, or the way that we're setting up the Door County Housing Trust, it's a completely separate, independent, nonprofit organization. So we are going to have 501c3 tax exempt status from the IRS. So yes, you would be able to make a donation of land, buildings, or money, and it would be tax deductible to whatever extent your accountant tells you that it is. The way it works is, and we're just in the beginning stages of figuring out the nitty-gritty details, and Myles agreed to be on the board last week, so I realized we've actually got 3 board members here. The way it works is, let's start with homeownership. So the housing trust would acquire the property, the building, whatever it was, and we would have set the parameters for who would be eligible to live in that. And we're still discussing like what the upper income level would be as far as someone that would be allowed to live there. We've all decided that we're only interested in workforce. We know there are seasonal housing issues, we know there's senior housing issues, but we're just interested in workforce. So what happens is the eligible person can buy the home and live in it. They can pass it down to heirs, they can sell it, but we cap the amount of appreciation that they can make on the home, so that when it's sold the next time, that person has to also meet our qualifications, and it has to be affordable to whatever the median income is at that point when they're selling it. Similarly, with an apartment building, we could work with a developer to have a certain number of units set aside for the housing trust to either manage, or that the developer would maybe manage for us. So that's the basic concept, is to put restrictions on who can live in the property and how much either rent can be or sales price can be charged. And we're also looking at things like you will not be able to do Airbnb. You will have to live here year round, and at least one person in the housing unit is going to have to be employed in the county.
That's good.
And one of the reasons that housing trust idea would be so important is at the bottom of the recession back in 2008, there was a lot of affordable housing built in Sister Bay in that $89,000 to about $140,000 range. It's great. It was a nice influx of, and a lot of my contemporaries were able to get their foot in the door in home ownership. But 10 years later, only 27 of those 75 units that were built in that particular development are owned by Door County residents. The other 50 are owned by people who rent them out or keep them as vacation homes. It's still good. We still have 27 more affordable homes that people have been able to get their foot in the door into ownership in Door County. But that's what happens if you don't have any sort of control mechanism on it. There's just such demand for second homes. And there were a few other people that commented something on those same lines. Another comment, pass the statewide minimum wage and raise it to $15 an hour.
Yes.
This will raise all boats to living wage and sustainability. I think I have this right, but if you go back to when a minimum wage in 1972, if it were simply adjusted for inflation every year, it would be over $15 an hour now. So that's not, as much as that sounds crazy, given that it's currently at $7.25, I believe. It's really not that crazy based on what it was when it started. But if you put that in perspective, all those numbers that Mariah showed us earlier about what the average wage is and what's affordable, you take that average, even at $15 an hour, you're making roughly $31,000 a year. I think I have that right, because I calculate it all the time in our office.
That's right. Double it, yeah.
So nobody making that can afford, not just buying, like yes, your first job out of college, you shouldn't be, I shouldn't say shouldn't, but maybe you shouldn't expect to buy a home at that price. But you can't even afford any rent in Door County. If you have a car payment and a student loan payment, and you're making $31,000 a year, your affordable rent level, if you're living alone, is like $600 to $700 a month, tops. And nothing exists. None of the new apartments that have been built in Sturgeon Bay and Sister Bay, nothing is even close to that price point.
Can I get something? When I was poking around on the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development website in the last week or two, I saw a statistic when I was trying to figure out how they calculate fair market rents, that in no county in the entire country can someone who makes minimum wage afford the fair market rent. And if you remember that slide that I had up there, the fair market rent that HUD has for Door County, you can't find anything to rent at those dollar amounts. At least I couldn't find anything.
Another comment, poor people in Door County used to be able to create housing over time. Now building codes and occupancy requirements prevent this. This is true. I grew up in one of those homes that was kind of built over time. When you get a few bucks, you put up some drywall. You get a few bucks more, and you get a door in the bathroom. That's neat. I thought my experience was very unique when I was growing up in Door County. And then over time, you find out that so many of your friends were doing the same thing. Edgewood Orchard Galleries, Ann Emerson would tell you the same story, the founder of that gallery. The Aureliuses would tell you that story. The Kastners. You can go on down the line. Amanda DeWitt and her family. I'm just mentioning those because those are all people that were within a year or two of my grade level growing up. And those are also a lot of people that have become major contributors to this community, icons of our arts community. And that was, I was just having a conversation the other day with Kathy Hoke at the Peninsula School of Art, who said she's having a more and more difficult time when someone comes in and they ask for who are the Door County artists, where are the studios. She says there's just, each year there's fewer, because that generation is dying out, and the generation behind them, or this generation, can't afford to just buy a cheap house, hang a shingle, and have a studio. You're seeing fewer and fewer of those. It's now confined to like the galleries, and maybe that's just natural evolution, but it's a product of not being able to just come in and build as you go. It's just not possible anymore. Another quick question, are there programs or tools that could limit the number or the feasibility of building large luxury second homes? Since we're on an island, I don't know if anyone here went to, what was a documentary that was shown at the auditorium last night?
One Big Home.
One Big Home.
Thomas Dana.
And maybe, I don't know if any of you can speak to what that documentary is all about, but that's kind of getting at this guy's question.
So Thomas Dana is a carpenter from Martha's Vineyard, and he was here, I think, 3 years ago, showing his documentary called One Big Home. And that it documents, well, he started, it was a 10-year project, and he started off with a completely different idea in mind, but by the end of it, what he was working toward was having his town on Martha's Vineyard vote to cap the maximum house size. So if you think, small cottages are being torn down in Door County and replaced with McMansions, some of the stuff that's going on in Martha's Vineyard is ridiculous. So that documentary is being shown all over the world. I'm on his email list, and so I get updates about all the places that are setting their own cap. The person that brought Thomas to Door County has a property in the village of Egg Harbor. He lives up here seasonally, and he really, really, really wants Door County to do this. When I explained to him that it wouldn't just be a rule, that it would be county zoning, the city zoning, the 4 villages, the 2 towns that have their own zoning in Southern Door, and then you still have 3 towns, including the town of Egg Harbor, that have their own, that don't have any zoning, that would have to adopt some sort of ordinance. I think he became quickly discouraged at how hard that would be to do in Door County. So it's not impossible, but to get it done countywide would be very difficult.
Love having Mariah on the panel.
You should have been sitting here.
Why don't we just pass it around and get some final thoughts from each of you on maybe what can people do to help move this issue forward and get some action?
We've already collaborated on this, actually.
We have a handout.
Oh, here.
No, you can.
Oh, we have a handout, is what she said. So essentially, we did already put together what is called What You Can Do. So it's a nice little handout talking about how you can educate yourself, so providing different resources you can check out, different community-wide meetings about housing that are coming up to be aware of, so come out and you can participate. Mariah's new website called housingdoorcounty.org, which is going to be coming up pretty soon, and also on that website is where you find a copy of this presentation as well, if you wanted to look a little bit more at all the great numbers and information that was provided. Lots of different things like volunteering, running for your local town board, educating yourself about proposed affordable housing developments being proposed. If you've got bedrooms to spare in your room, consider taking on roommates, which is if you want an immediate, there's a good one. And then consider building or allowing to be built a secondary dwelling unit on your property. And when building, be mindful of where you choose to build, construction practices, orientation, materials, things like that. So it's a great little handout. We also have our contact information on here, so if afterwards you need to pick any of our brains or have any other further questions or ideas, just feel free to reach out. We're all very accessible. Does anybody have anything else to add?
I'm going to add one thing. I want to just stress again that I know everybody is busy, but it's really important to pay attention to what's going on at your local plan commission and board meetings. I think almost all the municipalities have an email list because I get most of them. So you can just kind of look at the agenda and see whether housing is being discussed. Because there have been things that have been proposed previously that have gotten shot down because neighbors or neighborhoods didn't want them. There was a dorm proposed just south of Fish Creek about 20 years ago, and it didn't even make it. Either we had one public hearing and just cut it short because it clearly wasn't going to happen, or they didn't even make it that far, I can't remember. But so it is important to show that there are people out there that support having affordable housing in their community. So I encourage you to start going to, or at least paying attention to the agendas for those meetings.
Yeah, and I guess as a final note, I'm going to hammer down the whole concept of energy efficiency, and I want to tell you that it's coming to Door County. The effects of climate change are coming directly to Door County. I just learned day before yesterday, actually from Sue Van den Landenberg at the zoning department, planning department, that starting next year, there are new homes that are going to be built along shorelines, certain shorelines in Door County, will have to be built on stilts to raise them a foot above the floodplain level, and it's in preparation for rising waters and storm surges. And so if you don't think that climate change affects us, it will be affecting us next year. So I would encourage every single one of you to make it your personal mission to contact your legislators to encourage them to pay attention to implementing energy efficient strategies, designs, codes within our building community. And anyone that you know that is going to be building or remodeling, talk to them about making sure they work with someone who understands how to design and build an energy efficient building, whether it's a home or a commercial building, because this is our future at risk. And as I mentioned, it's already coming to Door County next year.
I don't want people to panic and think that we're going to look like Florida or something as far as the building on
Not
stilts.
Florida, but
Yeah,
No, we'll put skirting around the building.
yeah. Just really briefly, a lot of the regulations that my department has to enforce are handed to us by the state or by the federal government, and the floodplain regulations come from the state and the federal government, and they're creating kind of this new floodplain zone that's never been in Door County before. It's not a huge number of properties that are affected, but there are probably a couple hundred properties across the county that they might have to build on stilts if they're to build or rebuild.
Interesting, the rules get handed to you? I thought you were just like the planning Nazi.
Yeah.
who knew?
I wish.
No, see, I wanted people
On
to be
a
scared.
positive note,
Yeah.
I've been covering this issue basically since the first time I picked up a pen for the Pulse about 15 years ago. And right now I see more action and willingness from municipalities to talk seriously about making land available. Town of Liberty Grove is very progressive on it. Town of Gibraltar is talking about it right now with that potential land purchase. The city of Sturgeon Bay is talking about it. The county of Door is talking about it. There are, and the village of Egg Harbor right here has talked about making some land available for previously dorms, but they're still looking at ways to try and get something built there out by the water treatment plant. So that is encouraging, because now there is actually an option for the housing trust if one of those towns were to make some land available. That 15 years ago was not. People basically were saying, when I'd sit in these meetings, just, okay, we can't do anything about it. But now finally people are starting to say, maybe we can, and maybe we can get creative and address this problem. So I'd like to thank Virge, Mariah, and Amber for some really great information. Thank you so much for doing this.